In a quiet, wood-panelled office in Berlin on March 17, 1943, a German admiral unfolded a single sheet of paper. Numbers, not bullets, that could kill a nation's hope. It wasn't a superweapon, nor a hidden army. It was a factory an ocean away, projected to build a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. First came laughter, then fear, then denial, because if it was true, war had moved from battlefields to assembly lines, and Germany had already lost without knowing it. This is the story of how one fact, too terrifying for ideology to accept, sealed the fate of the Third Reich, and how arithmetic, not myth, wrote the end of a regime as that shape our world. A killing prophecy. In Berlin's quiet, wood-panelled hush on March 17, 1943, a German admiral opened a single sheet of numbers that sounded like footsteps in a dark hallway. Steady, inevitable, impossible to ignore. It didn't promise a miracle weapon. It predicted a factory across the ocean that would roll out a 4-engine bomber every hour. The room scoffed, ideology smirked, but the math didn't blink. If those numbers were real, the war was no longer decided by courage in trenches. It was decided by conveyor belts, jigs, and rivet guns, and Germany's fate had already been stamped like a serial number. Picture Berlin in early 1943, not triumphant, not defeated, but suspended in a dangerous illusion where parade ground certainty still wrapped itself around bruised realities from Stalingrad and North Africa. In this atmosphere walked Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, a professional among zealots, trained to follow evidence even when it dragged him toward conclusions no one wanted to hear. On his desk lay a concise intelligence brief, a single page with a claim so audacious it felt like a taunt. An American plant, Willow Run, was projected to mass-produce a 4-engine heavy bomber in a rhythm closer to automobiles than aircraft, approaching one completed B-24 per hour. To minds shaped by German craftsmanship, the patience of jigs, hand-fit tolerances, the artisanal pride of aviation, this was a contradiction in terms. Big bombers were not stamped like fenders. They were coaxed into being. They took weeks, sometimes months. The first response within the upper echelons was laughter, the kind that shields the mind from fear. America, in Nazi propaganda, was a disordered marketplace of races and immigrants, a place of refrigerators and razor blades, not strategic weapons. The idea that such a society could produce a bomber, an 18-ton latticework of aluminum, hydraulics, controls, and engines, every 60 minutes sounded like a carnival barker's pitch. And yet the sources were not carnival barkers. They were businessmen reporting factory footprints that bred their own weather. Diplomats seeing production targets with suspicious zeros. Engineers whispering of an assembly philosophy that treated bombers like Model Ts, broken into sub-assemblies, moved, timed, measured, and repeated. Canaris understood the gravity because he understood the arithmetic of industrial war. The numbers were merciless. 1 an hour implied 24 a day, 700 plus a month, out of a single site. Even if the projection proved optimistic, even if the cadence settled to something slower, the principle was the doom, repeatable throughput at scale. Immune to the mystique of craft because it worshipped only the god of volume. This was not a claim about American genius. It was a claim about American systems. It meant specialized tooling, line balancing, tact-time discipline, training programs that turned novices into efficient specialists within days, and supply lines fattened to keep every station fed. It meant the center of gravity of the war tilting from heroics to logistics. In Berlin, the counter-argument sounded reassuring. Germany had quality, superior pilots, and innovations on the drawing board that would stun the world. But quality can be drowned, pilots cannot be cloned, and paper miracles do not scramble. What happens when an enemy can absorb losses because replacements are already in crates, already in transit, already slotted into squadrons whose manuals have been standardized down to the torque on a bolt. What happens is that the war ceases to be a duel of brilliant thrusts and becomes a grinder. The side with the deeper bin of parts, fuel, and trained hands wins the right to make mistakes and to recover from them. For Canaris, the report was a fracture line between two worldviews. In one, victory is a moral right guaranteed by will, race, and destiny. In the other, victory emerges from measurable flows, tons per month, units per shift, man-hours per airframe, refinery output per day. The Admiral was not a romantic. He knew what the Red Army's revival signalled, what the Royal Air Force's night war had been training toward, and what the US 8th Air Force intended once escorts stretched deep into the Reich. Add to that an American industrial base accelerating from peacetime idling to wartime surge, and the graph lines were not just ominous, they were terminal. The tragedy is that strong intelligence often arrives dressed as bad news, and power structures built on ideology reject bad news the way a body rejects a transplant. When the analysts cross-checked their inputs, commercial chatter, neutral nation observers, even allied attachés exchanging uneasy notes, a picture resolved. Willow Run was not myth, it was method. The report did not crow, it warned. It said, in essence, if this is a war of factories, we must think like factories, target like factories, and decide like managers with a stopwatch in one hand and a flowchart in the other. Anything less is theatre. But theatre was what the leadership preferred, the theatre of certainty, of speeches that promised wonder weapons and destiny's favour. Laughter was safer than recalculation. Dismissing a memo was easier than retooling a strategy, and so a single page, one that did not shout, only measured, became a quiet prophecy. Not because it foretold a mystical future, but because it translated the future into rates, cycles, and lead times that any foreman could understand and any zealot could not afford to admit. What makes this moment chilling is not the claim of 1 per hour alone. It's the recognition that once a civilization learns to turn complexity into sequence, and sequence into rhythm, the extraordinary becomes ordinary by design. A nation of varied hands, women stepping from homes to jig stations, black workers hired into lines that had once barred them, immigrants mastering a single precise motion repeated 1,000 times, could, together, overcome intricacy with repetition. The bomber was not simplified, the making of it was. In that shift lay a weapon more devastating than any rocket, a schedule that kept its promises. Thus point one closes where it began, with a page in Berlin, a silence in the room, and a man who understood that the most dangerous truths do not explode. They accumulate. They begin as whispers, an extra zero here, a longer line there, and end as shadows that blot out the noon sky. History remembers battles as noise and flame. It often turns, instead, on the soft scratch of a pen across paper, adding columns no one wants to total. A battle of ideologies, Germany's industrial blindness. Inside Hitler's circle, certainty was a drug, administered daily, filtered of doubt, and fatal in high doses. Stalingrad had shattered the myth. North Africa was slipping away, yet the story at the top stayed the same. Willpower would bend steel. Destiny would outfly math. Into that echo chamber walked a report that measured reality in tons and hours. Not slogans, and the ideology that had conquered Europe blinked, then looked away. By early 1943, the Reich was living in two worlds at once, one written by speeches, the other by supply. The first world still marched in perfect lines. German science was unsurpassed, German soldiers were invincible, German resolve would turn setbacks into legend. The second world spoke a different language where coal became heat, heat became steel, steel became wings, and wings needed gasoline, refined from plants the Allies were already mapping. Between those worlds stood an uncomfortable intermediary. Intelligence. It brought facts that didn't care about feelings, and in Berlin, Facts were becoming unwelcome guests. The ideological frame was seductive because it had once worked. Blitzkrieg looked like destiny when fuel, tires, radios, and trained crews all aligned in a sharp, short war. But speed is a promise that logistics must keep, and the war had outgrown its opening act. The Soviet Union refused to collapse on schedule. The Atlantic refused to be sealed. American industry refused to remain theoretical. In response, the regime doubled down on the theatre of superiority. Admit no weakness, declare new wonders, redefine defeats as flexible withdrawals. Reality, for a time, let the narrative live. Then Stalingrad put a date stamp on the bill. Industrial blindness did not mean ignorance of production. Germany measured its own outputs obsessively. The blindness lay in comparative thinking, what the other side was building, how fast, and what that implied 6 months hence. Leaders still imagined war as a contest of elite formations and rarefied technology where a handful of exceptional machines or men could tip the scales. That imagination failed to account for an opponent converting complexity into routine, training thousands to execute tiny slices of mastery so the whole could flow without bottlenecks. The report about a bomber each hour did not merely announce a number, it announced a mindset. It warned that the enemy had found a way to make the extraordinary ordinary. Consider the reflexive comfort the ideology provided. If the American workforce was undisciplined, then its factories could not be disciplined either. If a diverse society was chaotic, then its assembly lines must be chaotic too. If democracies were soft, then their losses would break their will. Each assumption dissolved when touched by the simplest evidence: standardized jigs, tack times pinned to wall clocks, sub-assembly kits staged like choreography, and shifts that turned fatigue into relay rather than collapse. The prejudice that dismissed the hands also dismissed the products those hands could produce in symphony. There was a second layer to the blindness, a faith in silver bullets. Wonder weapons, the phrase that promised to leapfrog arithmetic, tantalized leaders who did not want to re-engineer the present. Rockets would terrorize cities, jets would erase bomber streams, secret devices would snatch back the initiative. Each had technical brilliance and each could have been formidable, given time, fuel, trained crews, and numbers. Ideology celebrated the prototype and ignored the pipeline. It fell in love with the first flight and forgot the 1,000th maintenance hour. It made strategy out of headlines, not flowcharts. Intelligence, meanwhile, piled up like snow on a roof, not a storm in a single night, just steady weight. Reports from neutral capitals noted oddities that only made sense in aggregate: rail cars of identical fixtures, government contracts for unimaginable volumes of rivets, labor training schools built beside plants, airfields widened not for a few flagships but for regiments of machines that would need parking, servicing, and turnover. Each datum alone was ignorable. Together they announced intention. The intention was not to build a better airplane, it was to build airplanes better. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanze or the Berghof, depending on the day, briefings evolved into rituals of reassurance. Charts were props unless they confirmed a prior belief. Dissent was not debate, it was disloyalty. In such air, the most useful voice is the one least heard, the one that says, "We are wrong in a way that can be measured." Canaris' world was measurement. He had no doctrine to sell, only rates to report. He understood that accepting the report forced a cascade of decisions: prioritize oil and transportation targets, disperse industry faster, standardize parts across models, accelerate training pipelines, ration pilot hours for survival, and, most crucially, reframe the war around endurance rather than edge. None of that fit the heroic story the regime wanted to tell itself. The industrial blindness also had a moral root. To see clearly would require acknowledging the people who would make the enemy's miracle possible: women stepping into skilled industrial roles, minorities advancing into jobs long denied, immigrants whose accents were less important than their cycle time and accuracy. Nazi ideology could not compute that such a workforce could outperform its mythic ideal. And so the lens blurred the image until it matched the dogma, even as reality sharpened beyond the glass. Great powers do not lose because they never had information. They lose because they sought it badly. The Reich sought it for confirmation, not correction. It placed ego above calibration. It chose the applause line over the production line. When the report about hourly bombers arrived, the rational response would have been terror at scale, followed by adaptation at speed. The actual response was ridicule, followed by delay. Delay in war is defeat scheduled. Point 2 closes on the hinge between belief and throughput. Ideology promised that will could outrun supply, that destiny could outvote arithmetic. But factories are polling stations where only numbers count, and the ballots are cast in shifts, crates, and gallons. When a state cannot read those results, it doesn't just miscalculate, it builds its collapse into the plan. The impossible truth: a bomber every hour. 18 tons of aluminum engines, hydraulics, and nerves, finished not in months, not in weeks, but on the beat of a clock. To the German mind in 1943, it sounded like a conjurer's lie, a 4-engine heavy bomber emerging every 60 minutes. Yet the math made a colder promise. If production could be taught to keep time, then the sky itself could be filled on schedule. To understand why 1 bomber per hour felt impossible, start with the object itself. The B-24 Liberator was not a toy. It was an airborne machine room, over 1 million parts, miles of wiring, control runs that had to move like joints in a living body, tolerances that punished sloppiness with death at altitude. Traditional aircraft building treated such complexity as a bespoke craft. Skilled workers measured by feel, panels were persuaded into place, and final assembly required artisans who knew every quirk of a fuselage by touch. This culture guarded quality, but it also guarded time. The calendar was its secret ingredient. Now imagine telling that culture to move aside for a stopwatch. The claim embedded in 1 per hour was not that airplanes had become simple. It was that their making had been decomposed into hundreds of simple things, sequenced, synchronized, and stabilized. Each station would see a sliver of the beast, master that sliver, and pass it on without waiting for a genius to wander over with a solution. In other words, the miracle was not in the airframe. It was in the choreography. At the heart of this choreography lived several unforgiving ideas. First, line balancing. No station should starve or choke the next. If a wing box took 40 minutes and a tailplane took 20, the system would either stack unfinished work like cordwood or waste its own capacity. The solution was to retime tasks, split them, or tool them so the average pace, the tact, matched the promised rhythm. Second, fixture discipline. Jigs held parts in perfect geometry, removing the need for artisanal fitting and making quality the default, not the rescue. Third, parts kitting and material flow. Every bolt, bracket, and harness arrived at the station already counted and staged so the workers' hands did not hunt. They executed. Such methods sound clean on paper and messy on a real floor, where reality sheds plans like skin. Early days proved it. Output stumbled, defects spiked, nicknames like "Will it run?" took root. But iteration is the hidden engine of mass production. The same measurements that embarrassed a line 1 week let it improve the next. Why did Station 27 lose 9 minutes per unit? Why did the nacelle harness fail fit at a 3% rate? Which drill pattern cracked ribs past a threshold? The answers did not require oracles. They required graphs pinned to corkboard, foremen who listened, and engineers who preferred a screwdriver to a speech. The hour cadence also demanded a second miracle that looked mundane: training at scale. It is one thing to build a line around veterans. It is another to feed that line with thousands of new hands who must reach competence fast. Here the heresy deepened. Work was redefined not as be an aircraft builder, but as perform this motion, to this standard, for this interval. A person who had never seen a bomber could, within days, become the best in the building at a single. Vital motion, drill, deburr, rivet, inspect, over and over, until the sound of their tool became the plant's metronome. Pride shifted from owning the whole to perfecting the part. Critics scoffed that such segmentation would destroy quality. They were not wholly wrong, unless inspection and feedback were elevated to a parallel religion. In an hourly line, defects are not shame. They are signals. Catch them early, code them precisely, and feed them back to design, tooling, or training by the next shift. Let them escape and the line pays in rework that strangles the very cadence it worships. The most successful mass production flaws are not blind to mistakes. They are addicted to finding them while they are still small enough to kill with a pen stroke. Why did this matter? Strategically. Because time is the true currency of war production. If a factory can convert 1 hour into one bomber reliably, then a week is a squadron and a month is a campaign's worth of replacements. Losses that would break a bespoke system become absorbable. Doctrine can grow bolder when logistics can catch it. Air forces can experiment with tactics, accept attrition, and still return tomorrow with full strength. The enemy, watching, begins to lose not just machines, but the bet that today's damage will slow the next day's blow. There is also a psychological inversion at work. The artisanal shop flatters the exceptional worker. The synchronized line flatters the system. In wartime system scale, a single ace cannot fly 2 sorties at once. A mature line can finish 2 airplanes at once, if fed correctly. This is not an argument against excellence. It is an argument for making excellence reproducible. The hourly claim said, in effect, excellence has been templated and therefore multiplied. Of course, nothing about an hourly bomber line is inevitable. It requires upstream miracles, suppliers that hit their own rhythms, rail that delivers on time, refineries that do not go dark, and managers who can translate numbers into action without bluster. Downstream, it requires airfields, crews, spares, and fuel enough to turn finished airframes into force. The promise collapses if any link tolerates wishful thinking. That is precisely why, to the ideologue, the number felt insulting. It implied an entire civilization had learned to cooperate on schedule. What makes 1 per hour so threatening to an opponent is not the headline, it is the compounding. An hour is a trickle, a season is a flood. When a rhythm persists, it builds the future in advance. Inventory in crates, crews in classrooms, replacements in transit, so that the battlefield storms wash over a shoreline already rebuilt last night. That is how arithmetic defeats romance. It does not negotiate. It accrues. Point 3 ends on the clock that never looks away. The marvel is not speed for its own sake, but reliability. The knowledge that at the top of the hour another shadow will roll toward the runway. In war, predictability is power. When production keeps its appointments, strategy can too. The American reality, the Willow Run factory. On Michigan farmland where corn once swayed, a building rose so vast people said it had its own weather. Inside, bombers did not arrive. They emerged, section by section, hour by hour, from a mile of choreography that turned complexity into routine. This was not a myth sung by propaganda. It was a metronome made of steel, jigs, and human rhythm, and it would write its signature across the German sky. Begin with the ground itself, a footprint so large the human eye loses scale. The main building at Willow Run stretched like a horizon made of trusses, concrete, and glass, a single, continuous room designed not for spectacle, but for flow. The plan was industrial architecture as strategy. Straight runs where straight runs were possible, feeder lines where the product demanded tributaries, and a famous right-angle tax turn where county lines forced the assembly track to bend, and the engineers turned an inconvenience into an engineering flourish. People came to gawk at the room. They left talking about the line. When a visitor stepped onto the floor, the first impression was not noise but order. Pallets arrived in sequence rather than in piles. Sub-assemblies, tail cones, wing sections, nacelles, cockpit modules, moved like rafts on a river with signs that announced their next confluence. Overhead cranes didn't wander. They traced routes planned into the ceiling. Tool shadow boards drew the silhouette of each wrench and drill, so absence shouted louder than a checklist. The eye could follow a single part number from dock to station to airplane, and that traceability, so boring, so bureaucratic, was the plant's real engine. What separated Willow Run from the old guard was not bravado but humility before process. The leaders asked unromantic questions. How many seconds does it take for a worker to fetch that crate? How many steps between holes does a drill operator walk in a shift? How many bad rivets escape Station 19, and what do they have in common? Each answer became a small edit to reality. The shelf moved 2 feet, the kit reordered so the hand never crosses itself, a new drill jig that refuses to meet metal unless alignment is true. None of these changes make headlines. All of them make hours. A plant like this eats inputs and excretes outputs with a tempo that punishes fantasy. Raw material did not appear by magic. Rail spurs, trucking timetables, and warehouse slots were synchronized to shift changes like choreography. Suppliers were not vendors in the casual sense. They were stations outside the walls, bound to the same discipline. Pack by operation, label by sequence, deliver by clock. Inside, training schools sat in the plant's shadow, converting civilians into specialists who could join midstream without stalling the current. The school's curriculum was reality in miniature. Practice on scrap to hit the spec, then graduate to the line where spec is the air everyone breathes. There was romance here, but of a specific kind, the romance of systems that work. Watch a fuselage shell arrive bare and leave bristling with structure, wiring harnesses clipped into raceways built on templates that made wrong routing physically difficult. Watch a wing section raised into place by fixtures that zeroed alignment before a human checked it, so the human could spend attention on exceptions rather than on the ordinary. Watch an instrument panel arrive as a tested unit, not a box of dials, so the difference between nearly done and ready could be measured in minutes, not hope. The sensation is not of rushing, but of keeping promises to time. Set against the ideological contempt of the Reich, Willow Run's floor read like a rebuttal written in steel. The workers were not uniform. The work was. Women who had never imagined themselves in industry became experts whose hands set tact for the building. Black workers walked onto lines that had once barred them and discovered that a jig did not care about prejudice. It cared about holes that met a drawing. Immigrants arrived with accents and left with muscle memory, teaching the next wave the trick of the wrist that shaved seconds without shaving quality. Diversity was not a slogan here. It was a statistical advantage. Many kinds of people meant many ways to solve a problem, and a culture that rewarded the solution, not the resume. The plant's early stumbles became law precisely because they were measured. Nicknames like "Will it run?" bit because they were partly true. Fixes bit back because data made them precise. An hour lost at Station 27 was not a mystery. It was a chart. A quality spike on a Tuesday shift pointed to a tool change or a training gap, not to fate. The same record-keeping that made the place feel bureaucratic also made it self-correcting. Engineering did not sit in a distant office. It walked the line with a notebook, changed a fixture, swapped a sequence, and came back tomorrow to see if the graph moved. What does an hourly bomber look like from above? Not a single snake of aluminum, but a lattice of flows, feeder lines for wings, tail assemblies, and nacelles, each with their own tact, converging on final assembly like rivers into a bay. The last hour is a wedding. Modules meeting the fuselage, systems plugged and tested, fluids filled, engines turned, inspectors signing off with a stamp that meant something. And even here, the work is not done. Rollout leads to ground tests, then to flight test, then to a final pass, where defects go to die. The rhythm does not stop at the door, it continues on the ramp. The deeper truth is that a factory like Willow Run was not only making airplanes, it was making a kind of national muscle memory. Every improvement taught at one station propagated sideways to its neighbors and outward to suppliers. Every standard work card stabilized one motion and freed thought for the next bottleneck. In a year, 1,000 tiny edits accumulate into a miracle that looks, from a distance, like speed.
Up close, it looks like respect for measurement.
For craft redefined, for the person at the station whose idea saves 12 seconds and, by season's end, a squadron. Finally, consider what this reality did to strategy. A plant that can promise a cadence allows commanders to promise operations. Replacement rates stop being estimates. They become tables aligned to calendars. Training syllabi can be set to production forecast. Maintenance depots can stock parts according to the line's bomb rather than to superstition. And above enemy cities, the sky reflects this logic. The air campaign ceases to be a series of heroic raids and becomes a pressure system, arriving not as a surprise, but as weather. Point 4 closes where its floor begins, at the clock. Every time the minute hand passes the mark, another airframe rolls toward daylight, a product of a building that turned work into rhythm and rhythm into power. In the end, Willow Run's most dangerous weapon was not aluminum, it was reliability. Contradicting Nazi ideology, the diverse workforce. On a factory floor, the ideology couldn't explain. The hands it despised set the pace. Women gripped rivet guns. Black mechanics signed off inspections. Immigrants taught perfect motions in accents the dogma mocked, and the line did not care who did the work, only that the work kept time. If prejudice writes myths, production writes receipts, and Willow Run's receipts arrive by the hour. Walk the floor at shift change and watch the myth unravel. Helmets and headscarves, coveralls and lunch pails, faces from every neighborhood of America stream beneath the same roof toward stations that will turn their separate lives into a single rhythm. Nearly a third are women, many fresh from kitchens and classrooms, now masters of guns that hammer aluminum into strength. They carry nicknames like Rosie, borrowed from posters and returned as skill. They are not mascots here, they are tact. Beside them stand black workers hired in numbers that would have been unthinkable before the war, now indispensable in roles from machining to inspection, because a jig cares only for the hole that meets the drawing. Immigrants, Polish, Italian, Greek, Hungarian, compare notes about a new fixture in 3 languages and still agree on the click that means the torque is right. In this place, diversity is not decoration. It is throughput. The training school sits like a refinery of potential. New arrivals do not begin with history lessons. They begin with hands-on drills that teach one motion at a time until accuracy becomes reflex. A woman who has never read a blueprint learns to read templates by touch. A man who has never held a micrometer learns to trust the line at which a gauge refuses to lie. Instructors break the aircraft into tasks so small that confidence finds room to stand, then knit those tasks together into sequences that borrow courage from practice. Graduation is not a certificate. It's a slot on the line where others are waiting for the next pair of hands to keep the promise of the hour. Work that outsiders imagine as brute force turns out to be choreography. Riveting is conversation. One worker sets, one drives, one checks, and the music is the pitch that tells the trio they've made a tight, clean bond. Wiring is cartography. Harnesses follow channels traced by templates that refuse wrong routes. Inspection is a hunt for patterns, not villains. If a defect recurs, the question is not who failed, but where does the process let failure in? The culture punishes arrogance and rewards curiosity. The person who asks why something takes 12 seconds longer today than yesterday has more status than the person who pretends not to notice. The miracle under the lights is psychological as much as mechanical. This workforce is learning a new story about work, that dignity can live in repetition done well, that mastery can be narrow and still profound, that 1,000 small excellences can build a machine capable of crossing an ocean. The propaganda that once belittled these hands as undisciplined meets a flaw where discipline is audible. Breaks are timed to the line. Returns are punctual because the station downriver depends on the station upriver to feed it. Pride is contagious. When the airplane moves, everyone who touched it feels the motion as their own. None of this erases friction. There are arguments at benches, mistakes at stations, sick days that leave gaps, and nights when fatigue dulls the senses. But the system assumes human limits and bends itself to protect them. Job rotation to rest muscles, jigs that reduce strain, tool balances that turn heavy into bearable. Supervisors who once measured worth in barked orders begin to measure worth in solved bottlenecks. The hero is no longer the loudest voice, but the person who rearranges a kit so the left hand never crosses the right, saving 2 seconds a cycle, 2 seconds that, multiplied by 1,000 becomes a day, and multiplied by a season becomes squadrons. Set this reality against the ideology that mocked it. The Reich imagined strength as uniformity and purity. Willow Run proved that strength is variety coordinated. The Reich preached that command produces order. Willow Run showed that design produces order, design of tools, stations, and feedback loops that make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. The Reich trusted destiny. Willow Run trusted clocks. In that difference lay the quiet revolution. Power moved from myth to method, from the chosen few to the organized many. Consider the individual stories that together compose the cadence. A widow who lost a brother at sea learns to buck rivets so cleanly her row becomes the troubleshooting standard for the bay. A machinist from Alabama, turned inspector, catches a subtle misalignment that only shows itself under a particular light. His note leads to a revised fixture and a permanent fix. A recent immigrant whose English is a tangle becomes the shop's fastest at a difficult grommet install. The trick is in a twist of the wrist, and he teaches it to a dozen others without a shared verb between them. These are not anecdotes stapled to a narrative. They are the narrative, the only one the line will accept, because they move the needle that everyone can see. This workforce's greatest contribution is cultural. It normalizes the idea that ordinary people, given clear work and decent tools, can achieve feats once reserved for legends. That normalization is an industrial weapon. It means management can plan in weeks, not wishes. It means the plant can absorb turnover without losing tempo.
It means a flood of replacements can join and the river keeps its banks.
Prejudice falters in such a climate not because speeches defeat it, but because the hour will not wait for it. Whatever slows the line is the enemy. Whatever speeds it is a friend. Bias that wastes time learns to hide or to die. The enemy watches the outputs, not the inputs, and draws the wrong conclusion, that the machines must be simpler, the crews less skilled, the standards lower. Truth is more difficult. The machines are as demanding as ever. The crews are skilled differently. The standards are embedded into fixtures and gauges that make compliance the path of least resistance. The workforce's diversity is not a cost paid for a political point. It is a hedge against blind spots and a generator of small, constant improvements. Many minds find more shortcuts than a few, and the shortcuts add up to hours that add up to airplanes. In the end, the contradiction becomes a verdict. An ideology that cannot respect the hands that build will misjudge the power those hands can wield when coordinated. A factory that learns to harness difference will outlast a regime that only knows how to command sameness. At Willow Run, the proof rolled past the doors on its own landing gear. Every time the clock struck the mark, the line said the same quiet thing. Bring us more hands, and we will make you more wings. Hitler's denial, the rejection of fact. Presented with arithmetic that could not flatter him, the dictator chose a mirror that did. The report said factories, cadence, inevitability. The court said destiny, purity, wonder weapons. Laughter did the work of strategy. Ego did the work of analysis, and a single page that might have changed the plan was filed under heresy. The path from fact to policy inside Hitler's headquarters narrowed as the war grew wider. What began in 1939 as a regime energized by risk-taking had, by 1943 hardened into a ritual of affirmation where only reassuring data survived the journey to the top. The geography shifted from Chancellery to Berghof to Wolfschanze, but the weather inside stayed the same, a pressure system that flattened descent. Briefers learned the choreography, show charts that rise where the leader expects ascent, explain losses as anomalies or treachery, and keep the room's temperature warm enough to melt unwelcome numbers before they reached the desk. Into this climate came the intelligence about Willow Run and hourly bombers, prosaic,
Unemotional and devastating.
It did not accuse or moralize, it measured. It translated American intent into rates and rhythms. The appropriate reaction would have been strategic triage, accelerate dispersion of industry, mass production of standardized fighters, ruthless prioritization of oil and transport targets, and a cold-eyed plan to conserve pilots as irreplaceable capital. Instead, the reaction was aesthetic. The claim was ugly to ideology. Therefore, it was untrue. The leadership did not rebut the numbers. It ridiculed the premise that such numbers mattered. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's showman-in-chief, embodied the defense mechanism. As custodian of a myth, air power, as a realm of aces, prestige projects, and personal swagger, he could not afford to cede the narrative to factories and freight timetables. To accept the report was to accept his own failure to anticipate an enemy's industrial mobilization, and to admit that the Luftwaffe's procurement, training, and fuel policies were misaligned with a long war. So he laughed. Laughter is a quick solvent for inconvenient truths. It turns a threat into a joke and a decision into a delay. Adolf Hitler's denial was deeper because it was doctrinal. His worldview assigned moral qualities to nations and then expected physics to respect those assignments. A mongrel democracy could not, in this catechism, surpass a disciplined Reich in organized output. A workforce of women, minorities, and immigrants could not outperform a pure nation in measured skill. To admit otherwise would be to confess that the ideology inverted reality. When confronted with production projections, one bomber each hour, hundreds per month from a single plant, the mind did not ask, what follows from this? It asked, who benefits from this lie? The answer, inevitably, was enemies within or without. Inside this echo chamber, even practical men learned the art of self-editing. Albert Speer understood the stakes of throughput and standardization, but the room punished urgency that contradicted the leader's mood. Staff officers distilled analyses until all that remained was flavor, not nutrition. The state performed competence on paper, programs, committees, decrees, while postponing the uncomfortable reallocations that might have slowed the bleeding, cancelling prestige projects, simplifying model lines, and starving anything that did not directly increase fuel, fighters, and flak. Denial does not merely ignore, it distorts. Pet projects blossomed under the sun lamp of favour. V-weapons that dazzled without decisive effect. Jets envisioned as bombers when they were needed as interceptors. Late war variants spawned faster than training. Syllabi could adapt, or depots could stock spares. Each solution produced a dozen new coordination problems. The organization responded with more orders, more secrecy, more promises. None of these weighed as much as a single ton of high-octane fuel delivered, predictably to a squadron with pilots who had flown enough hours to survive combat. The cost of rejecting the factory logic was paid first in the air. As Allied raids intensified and escorts reached deeper, the Luftwaffe's losses outpaced its ability to replace machines and men. A leadership that believed will could outfly attrition discovered that courage without fuel is a ceremony and skill without hours is a rumor. The exercise books of training schools, the maintenance logs at frontline fields, and the repair queues at engine plants all told the same quiet story. The math was winning. A factory promises tomorrow. Denial borrows from it. There is a human tragedy nested inside the institutional failure. Intelligence officers who did their work, collecting, cross-checking, warning, found themselves cast as defeatists. The social cost of speaking plainly rose until plain speech retreated into diaries and whispers. Systems meant to protect the state from fantasy instead protected the fantasy from the state. In that reversal lies the essence of authoritarian brittleness. By punishing corrective feedback, the system forfeits the only mechanism that could have saved it from its own plan. Denial also thrives on misframed comparisons. The leadership compared their best to the enemy's average, their prototypes to the enemy's production, their rhetoric about endurance to the enemy's schedules for it. A proper comparison would have felt unheroic. Sortie rates, serviceability percentages, pilot replacement times, refinery outputs after each raid, and the ratio between hours trained and hours flown in combat. Such tables are dull. They are also war. The Hourly Bomber report was one such table in embryo. It said this is their slope. If ours is flatter, the intersection point is not a debate. It is a date. In the end, Hitler's rejection of facts was not a single decision, but a culture of decisions, 1,000 small evasions that added up to a grand refusal. The paper on the desk was only a symbol. The real choice happened each time a leader preferred applause to adjustment, a factory kept too many models alive, a trainer stretched fuel by cutting hours, a briefer trimmed a graph to spare a temper. None of these acts felt like defeat in the moment. Together, they set the clock. Point 6 closes where denial always ends, with reality keeping the appointment that ideology tried to cancel. The sky over Germany did not consult doctrine. It reflected logistics. Each hour that Willow Run kept, the regime lost room to pretend. When power chooses fantasy over feedback, it does not merely risk defeat, it schedules it. The price of truth, Admiral Canaris's fate. He warned them with numbers, and they answered with a noose. In a regime where flattery was strategy and denial was doctrine, the man who measured reality became the traitor of record. The page that predicted defeat could not be disproved, so its messenger had to be erased. In a war cabinet that rewarded certainty and spectacle, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an anomaly, a professional whose power derived from information, not from adulation. He ran an intelligence service that trafficked in fragments, reports from docks and dinner tables, whispers on telephones, shipping tallies, factory footprints, each insignificant alone, decisive together. This vocation made him useful when victory seemed effortless. It made him intolerable when facts began to scrape against the story the regime told itself. By 1943, the scrape had become a grind. The Willow Run brief was only one page among thousands, but it symbolizes the line he would not cross, the line between what was wanted and what was true. He knew the cost of that stance even as he adopted it. Intelligence is a dangerous profession in any state. In a state allergic to correction, it is lethal. The court had learned to read tone before tables, a chart that rose in the wrong place, a forecast that cut across a promise, a sentence that refused to soften its edges. Each could be career-ending. Canaris's life became a narrowing corridor of choices in which the least dishonest path still led toward suspicion. His enemies did not have to invent much. The Abwehr was aristocratic in culture, cautious by habit, and a poor fit for a regime that prized theatrical loyalty. It employed men who preferred nuance to slogans. It tolerated disagreement because truth seldom comes in a shout. These traits look like virtues in normal light. Under the harsh lamp of wartime paranoia, they cast treason-colored shadows. Rival agencies sharpened their knives. The accusation did not need proof. It needed momentum.
Whisper that the intelligence chief has lost his nerve.
Note how often his reports bring bad news.
Observe that he counsels limits when the moment demands boldness.
Let the pattern assemble itself. What transformed suspicion into a sentence was the convergence of two trajectories: the Reich's descent into catastrophe and the internal resistance's ascent toward desperation. Canaris's moral revulsion at SS crimes was not an abstract discomfort. It was a daily fact that bent his actions. He shielded some who could be shielded. He blurred lines where he could. He opened corridors through which a few could pass. None of this changed the war's course. All of it changed his. The circle tightened. Files were read with malice. Friendships were recast as conspiracies. Private reservations hardened into public charges once the July 20th plot failed, and the regime hungered for culprits large enough to terrify the rest. His arrest was not dramatic. It was bureaucratic, a signature here, a knock at a door, a transfer from relevance to custody. In the files lay the ammunition the regime preferred, diaries, conversations, the residue of a mind that would not surrender its standards to the tide. A show trial would have served, but efficiency won. A concentration camp, a rope or wire, the ritual of erasure performed away from microphones. There is a particular cruelty in killing a man whose crime was accuracy. It signals to all who remain that survival requires a new skill, the ability to be wrong on command. The personal story matters beyond its pathos because it reveals the cost of silencing feedback. An army that cannot hear intelligence becomes deaf to its own footsteps. It marches into traps it mapped itself. A government that treats analysts as enemies rewrites the job description of everyone who measures reality: pilot instructors, maintenance chiefs, factory foremen, logisticians, to include flattery. The system begins to choose the pleasant chart over the honest one, the optimistic rate over the achievable one, the prototype over the pipeline. Each choice feels small. Together, they add up to a strategy made of applause. Consider what was lost when Canaris was pushed aside. Not merely a man, but a way of thinking. That war is an exercise in calibration, that the enemy's capacities deserve respect rather than caricature, that humility before numbers is not weakness but prudence. Had that mindset prevailed even partially, the reaction to the Willow Run report might have been adaptation, consolidate models, harden oil and transport, flood the flak belt, conserve pilots, and accept that survival depended on interrupting a cadence, not outwilling it. Instead, the state severed its connection to its own senses. It traded correction for conviction and paid with its future. The fate of the truth-teller is a caution that travels well beyond its century. Organizations do not need dictators to become hostile to reality. They need only a culture that confuses loyalty with agreement. When a graph bends downward, someone must be allowed to say so without becoming the villain of the story. When an opponent's strength grows, it is safer to name it than to wish it away. The price of truth, unpaid, accrues interest. By the time the bill arrives, it looks like collapse. For the record, because records outlive regimes, the line is clear. The report about hourly bombers described a production rhythm that would, if unchallenged, overwhelm a defense predicated on scarcity. The leadership chose to treat that report as insult rather than instruction. The intelligence chief who would not bless the myth was stripped of rank, then dignity, then breath. The aircraft rolled, the squadrons formed, the sky darkened, and the prophecy on that page kept its appointment. The tragedy is not that one man could not stop it. It is that a system designed to echo could not listen when it mattered. Point 7 closes on a silence that says more than speeches. In the absence he left, the numbers kept speaking in the only voice they have: totals and rates, sorties and losses, arrivals and absences. Power can punish the messenger. It cannot cancel the message. Closing narration. History doesn't just turn at beaches and borders. It turns at benches and blueprints where numbers argue quietly and win loudly. A single page in Berlin measured a future no one wanted to admit, and an ocean away, a factory kept its promise, hour after hour, until the sky itself became a schedule. Ideology laughed. Arithmetic arrived. Leaders silenced the messenger. The message grew wings. In the end, the Reich was not defeated by a secret, only by sequence. Not by destiny, by delivery.
Not by myth, by method.
Willow Run stands as proof that a free, messy, many-handed society can turn complexity into rhythm and rhythm into power. The lesson survives its war. When facts are refused, collapse is planned. When facts are faced, the impossible becomes routine.